The sound of gunfire split the summer air like a whip crack, and Rose Dalton felt nothing at all as she squeezed the trigger a third time, watching the rattlesnake's head explode in a spray of dust and scales. It was August 1882 in Montrose, Colorado, and everything under the relentless sun felt bleached and brittle, including her heart. She holstered her Colt revolver with practiced efficiency, kicked the snake's carcass off the trail with her worn boot, and continued walking toward town as if she had done nothing more remarkable than swat a fly. The land stretched out around her in shades of copper and gold, the San Juan Mountains rising like jagged teeth against the horizon, and somewhere behind her lay the burned ruins of the only home she had ever known. Rose was 22 years old and had been alone for 3 months now, ever since the fire that took her father and younger brother in their sleep. She had been out checking the cattle that night, a task her father usually handled himself, but he had been feeling poorly and she had insisted. When she saw the orange glow against the black sky and heard the screams that cut off too quickly, she had run faster than she thought possible, but the flames were already consuming everything. The neighbors said it was the wood stove, a spark that caught the dry timber of their modest ranch house. They said she was lucky to be alive. Rose did not feel lucky. She felt like something essential had been carved out of her chest and replaced with stone. Montrose was growing, swelling with miners and ranchers and opportunists who saw the western slope as a place to make their fortunes now that the Utes had been forced onto reservation lands further south. Rose had been born here when it was barely a settlement, when her mother was still alive, and the world seemed gentler. Her mother had died of pneumonia when Rose was 12, and her father had raised her and her brother Thomas the only way he knew how, which meant she learned to shoot before she learned to sew, learned to break horses before she learned to bake bread, and learned to keep her tears to herself because crying did not fix broken fences or find lost cattle. The main street of Montrose was busy with afternoon commerce when Rose arrived. Wagons rolled past kicking up dust. Men gathered outside the saloon even though it was barely past noon, and women in their proper dresses moved between the general store and the post office with their market baskets. Rose was aware of how she looked among them, her dark hair pulled back in a severe braid, her clothing more suited to ranch work than social calls, her gun belt slung low on her hips. She was aware of the stares and the whispers, had been aware of them all her life. Rose Dalton, who rode like a man and shot like the devil himself. Rose Dalton, who never smiled and never softened. Rose Dalton, who was alone now and would likely stay that way. She needed supplies and she needed work. The small amount of money from selling what remained of the ranch and its cattle would not last forever. And she had discovered that opportunities for women without family connections were limited and largely unpleasant. She had been sleeping in a rented room above the boarding house, spending her days doing odd jobs for anyone who would hire her, avoiding the concerned questions from the few people who remembered her as a child. Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house kept trying to feed her extra portions at dinner. Mr. Garrett at the livery stable kept suggesting she might want to move east, stay with relatives, find a husband to take care of her. Rose had no relatives left, and the idea of a husband felt like a noose tightening around her neck. She was coming out of the general store with her parcels when she saw him for the first time. He was tall, lean in the way of men who spent their lives in the saddle, with dark hair that fell past his collar and eyes the color of creek water in summer. He was leading a paint horse down the street, talking to it in low tones, and there was something about the gentleness of his movements that made Rose stop and stare despite herself. The horse was limping, favoring its front left leg, and the man was patient as they made their slow way toward the livery stable. "That is Xavier Stone," said a voice beside her, and Rose turned to find Mrs. Henderson standing there with her shopping basket. The older woman had a knowing look in her eyes. "He has a ranch about 10 miles north of town, raises horses mostly. He brought them in from Wyoming territory about 2 years ago and has been building his operation since. Quiet fellow, keeps to himself, but fair in his dealings. Lost his wife in childbirth 5 years back, before he came here. The baby, too." Rose felt something flicker in her chest at that information, something that might have been sympathy if she had not forgotten how to feel such things. She watched Xavier Stone disappear into the livery stable with his injured horse, then turned back to Mrs. Henderson. "I need work. Real work, not washing dishes or mending clothes. Do you know anyone hiring ranch hands?" Mrs. Henderson's expression softened. "Oh, honey, most ranchers are not going to hire a woman for that kind of labor. It's too rough, too dangerous. Why don't you consider something more suitable? I could talk to Mrs. Patterson about taking you on as a seamstress. You're a bright girl, you could learn." "I don't want to learn to sew," Rose said flatly. "I know how to work cattle and horses. I know how to mend fences and break broncs. I need someone who will pay me fair wages for fair work." The older woman sighed. "You're just like your mother was, stubborn as a mule. But your mother learned to bend a little, learned that being a woman in this world means finding a different kind of strength. You might think about that." Rose did not want to think about that. She did not want to bend or soften or become something other than what she was. She had tried being soft once, had tried trusting that the world would be kind, and the world had burned her family alive while she was checking cattle in the dark. She picked up her parcels and walked away without another word, heading back toward the boarding house with her jaw set and her eyes fixed straight ahead. That night she lay in her narrow bed and listened to the sounds of Montrose settling into darkness. Someone was playing a fiddle in the saloon, the notes carrying on the warm breeze through her open window. A dog barked in the distance. Voices rose and fell in conversation somewhere below. Rose stared at the ceiling and thought about Xavier Stone and his injured horse, about the gentle way he had moved, about the loss that Mrs. Henderson had mentioned so casually. She thought about her own losses and wondered if there was a limit to how much a person could lose before they simply stopped being a person at all, before they became just a collection of reflexes and routines, going through the motions of living without actually feeling alive. She must have slept eventually because she woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of wagons rolling past below. She dressed quickly, strapped on her gun belt, and headed downstairs for breakfast. Mrs. Henderson served her eggs and biscuits with a worried look, but said nothing. Rose ate mechanically, tasting nothing, then headed out to see what work she could find for the day. The livery stable needed mucking out, which was dirty work but paid. Rose spent the morning shoveling manure and fresh straw, her muscles remembering the rhythm even though it had been months since she had done this kind of labor regularly. Mr. Garrett watched her work with a mixture of admiration and pity, and when she was done, he paid her and suggested again that ranch work was no life for a woman alone. Rose pocketed the coins and walked away before she said something she would regret. She was heading toward the saloon to see if they needed help hauling barrels when she saw Xavier Stone again. He was standing outside the land office with another man, examining what looked like a survey map. In the full light of day, she could see him more clearly. He was probably close to 30, with sun-weathered skin and the calloused hands of someone who worked hard for everything he had. There was a stillness about him that reminded her of deep water, a sense that what you saw on the surface was only a fraction of what lay beneath. As if feeling her gaze, he looked up. Their eyes met across the dusty street, and Rose felt something she had not felt in months, a tiny spark of recognition, as though some part of her that had gone numb was trying to wake up. Then she tore her gaze away and kept walking, annoyed at herself for staring, for feeling anything at all. She found work at the saloon helping to move barrels of beer up from the cellar, then spent the afternoon hauling water for the hotel. By the time the sun was setting, she was exhausted and dusty, and had earned enough to pay for another week in her room. She bought a simple dinner at the boarding house, endured Mrs. Henderson's attempts at conversation, then escaped back to her room to wash the day's grime away in the basin. She was sitting by the window, cleaning her revolver as the last light faded from the sky when there was a knock at her door. She tensed instinctively, her hand moving toward the gun even though it was disassembled. "Who is it, Mrs. Henderson?" "I have someone here who wants to talk to you about work." Rose reassembled the gun with quick, practiced movements, then stood and opened the door. Mrs. Henderson was there with her knowing smile, and beside her was Xavier Stone. Up close, he was even taller than she had thought, and his eyes were studying her with an intensity that made her want to step back. She held her ground. "Miss Dalton," he said, and his voice was low and rough like wind through canyon walls. "I heard you were looking for ranch work. I have a proposition for you, if you're willing to listen." Rose glanced at Mrs. Henderson, who was practically beaming, then back at Xavier Stone. Every instinct told her to say no, to close the door and keep herself sealed away where nothing could touch her. But she needed the work, and she was tired of hauling barrels and water. "I'm listening." "Not here," he said. "Come out to my place tomorrow morning. I will show you what I need and we can discuss terms. If you're not interested after seeing it, I will pay you for your time and bring you back to town." Fair enough. It was more than fair, and they both knew it. Rose studied his face, looking for signs of ulterior motives, but saw only honest directness. "What time?" "Dawn." "I will meet you at the livery stable." She nodded once, sharp and businesslike. Xavier Stone tipped his hat to her, nodded to Mrs. Henderson, and then he was gone, his boots heavy on the stairs. "Mrs. Henderson gave Rose a significant look that she ignored, then closed the door and went back to cleaning her gun. Her hands were steady, but something inside her chest was fluttering like a trapped bird. She told herself it was just nerves about a new job opportunity. She told herself it meant nothing. She barely slept that night and was up before the first light touched the sky. She dressed in her most practical clothes, braided her hair tightly, checked her gun, and headed downstairs. Mrs. Henderson was already in the kitchen, which was unusual, and pressed a packet of food into her hands. "For the ride," she said. "And Rose, give him a chance. Give yourself a chance." Rose did not ask what she meant. She took the food and walked through the quiet pre-dawn streets to the livery stable, where Xavier Stone was already waiting with 2 horses saddled and ready. He handed her the reins of a solid-looking bay mare without comment, and she swung up into the saddle with ease. He watched her, and she thought she saw a flicker of approval in his expression, but it was gone before she could be sure. They rode north out of Montrose as the sun rose behind them, painting the landscape in shades of rose and gold. The San Juan Mountains were dark silhouettes against the brightening sky, and the air was cool and fresh with the scent of sage and juniper. Xavier Stone rode easily beside her, not pushing for conversation, seemingly content with the silence. Rose appreciated that. Too many people felt the need to fill every moment with words, as if silence was something to be feared. His ranch came into view after about an hour of riding. It was situated in a broad valley with good water from a creek that ran year-round, protected from the worst winds by the rise of hills on 3 sides. The house was modest but well built, made of logs and stone with a wide porch across the front. There were several outbuildings including a barn, a bunkhouse, and a series of corrals where horses milled about. Rose counted at least 20 head, maybe more, a mix of breeds and colors. "I breed working horses," Xavier said as they rode into the yard. "Cow ponies mostly, sturdy animals that can handle rough terrain and long days. I have been building the herd slowly, buying good mares and a few quality stallions. The operation is growing faster than I can manage alone. I had a hand working for me, but he moved on last month, headed to California. I need someone who knows horses, who can help with training and breaking, who is not afraid of hard work." He dismounted and Rose did the same, her eyes scanning the property. It was well maintained, the fences in good repair, the buildings solid. The horses looked healthy and calm, which spoke well of how they were treated. "You know, most ranchers would not hire a woman for this kind of work," she said bluntly. "I know," Xavier said, "but I also know that skill matters more than what is between your legs, pardon the language. I have been asking around about you, Miss Dalton. People say you can ride anything with 4 legs and that you're honest in your dealings. That is what I need." Rose felt something in her chest loosen slightly, some tight knot of tension she had been carrying. "What are the terms?" "Room and board in the bunkhouse, plus $30 a month. It is rough work, long days, and I expect honesty and reliability. In return, I will teach you everything I know about horse breeding and training, which could be valuable if you ever want to start your own operation. I will not lie to you, Miss Dalton. It will not be easy, but it will be fair." $30 a month was generous, more than she could make doing odd jobs in town. Room and board meant she could stop paying for the boarding house. And the promise of learning more about horses, of building skills she could use in the future, that was worth more than money. Rose looked at Xavier Stone, at his weathered face and steady eyes, and made a decision. "When do I start?" "Now, if you are willing. I can bring your things out from town tomorrow." Rose held out her hand. "You have a deal, Mr. Stone." His hand engulfed hers, calloused and warm, and for a moment they stood there in the morning sunlight, shaking on it. Then he released her hand and gestured toward the corrals. "Let me show you around and introduce you to the horses. They're the real bosses here." The rest of that day passed in a blur of activity. Xavier showed her the entire operation, explaining his breeding program and his training methods. He had a good eye for horses and a patient approach that Rose recognized as rare. Many men broke horses through force and fear, but Xavier believed in taking time, building trust, letting the animal come to understand what was being asked of it. Rose found herself drawn into his explanations, asking questions, offering observations based on her own experience. They worked side by side until the sun was setting, and then Xavier showed her the bunkhouse. It was simple but clean, with 2 narrow beds, a wood stove, a table and chairs, and some shelves for personal belongings. "It is not much," he said, "but it is warm in winter and cool enough in summer. The well is behind the main house, and you are welcome to use the kitchen for cooking, though I usually eat simple meals, and you are invited to join me if you prefer not to cook alone." Rose set her gun belt on the table and looked around. It was more space than she had in the boarding house room, and it smelled like hay and wood smoke instead of other people's perfume and stale cooking. "It is fine," she said. "Better than fine." Xavier nodded. "I will head into town at first light tomorrow to get your things. Make yourself at home. If you need anything, the main house is always open." After he left, Rose sat on one of the beds and let herself feel the exhaustion that had been building all day. Her muscles ached pleasantly from good work, and her mind felt clearer than it had in months. She ate some of the food Mrs. Henderson had packed, drank water from the well that tasted of minerals and stone, and then lay down on the bed still fully clothed. Through the small window she could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, more stars than she ever saw in town, a vast glittering blanket of them. She fell asleep watching them, and for the first time in months she did not dream of fire. The days that followed developed a rhythm. Rose woke before dawn, washed at the well, and met Xavier at the corrals to begin the day's work. They fed and watered the horses, checked them for injuries or illness, worked on training the younger ones, and maintained the endless fences and buildings. Xavier was a patient teacher, showing her techniques she had never learned, explaining bloodlines and conformation, demonstrating how to read a horse's mood and respond accordingly. Rose soaked it all in like parched earth soaking up rain. They talked while they worked, brief exchanges about the horses or the work or the land. Xavier did not pry into her past, and she did not pry into his, but gradually she learned things. He had come from Wyoming after his wife died, needing a fresh start somewhere no one knew his story. He had spent 2 years drifting before settling here, working other people's ranches until he had saved enough to buy this land. He loved horses the way some men loved women or whiskey, with a devotion that was both practical and spiritual. He believed in doing things right even when it was harder, in keeping his word even when it cost him, in treating animals with respect because they deserved it. Rose found herself watching him sometimes when he did not know she was looking. Watching the way he moved around the horses, sure and steady. Watching the way his hands gentled a nervous mare or checked a hoof with infinite care. Watching the way the sunset light caught in his dark hair and painted his profile in gold and shadow. She told herself she was just observing a skilled horseman at work. She told herself it meant nothing, but something was changing inside her, so slowly she barely noticed. The stone weight in her chest was beginning to crack, tiny fissures letting in light. She found herself listening for Xavier's voice in the morning, found herself matching her movements to his when they worked together, found herself caring whether he approved of her work. It terrified her in a way that snakes and storms, and even the memory of fire did not. 3 weeks after she started working at the ranch, a late summer storm rolled in from the mountains. Rose and Xavier spent the afternoon securing everything that could blow away, bringing the horses into the barn, and battening down against the coming wind. The first drops started falling as they finished, fat and heavy, and then the sky opened up and the rain came down in sheets. They ran for the bunkhouse, both of them soaked within seconds, and tumbled through the door laughing. Rose stopped mid-laugh, startled by the sound of her own laughter, unable to remember the last time she had made that sound. Xavier was grinning at her, water dripping from his hair, and for a moment they just stood there looking at each other while the storm raged outside. "I should get back to the house," Xavier said finally, but he did not move. "You should," Rose agreed, but she did not move either. The air between them felt charged like the storm outside, crackling with something unnamed. Rose's heart was pounding, and she did not know if it was from the run or from something else entirely. Xavier took a step toward her, then stopped, his expression uncertain. "Rose," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name. "I need to tell you something." She waited, barely breathing. "I hired you because you needed work and because you are good with horses. That was true. But I also hired you because when I saw you in town, I felt something I have not felt since my wife died, something I thought I would never feel again. And these past weeks working beside you have only made it stronger. If that makes you uncomfortable, if you want to leave, I will pay you what I owe you and help you find other work. But I needed to be honest." Rose stood frozen, her wet clothes clinging to her skin, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to run, to protect herself from this vulnerability, to lock herself back behind the walls she had built. But another part, a part she thought had died in the fire with her family, was reaching toward Xavier like a flower reaching toward the sun. "I don't know how to do this," she said, and her voice cracked. "I don't know how to be soft anymore. I don't know if I ever really knew how." Xavier closed the distance between them in 2 strides. He raised his hand slowly, giving her time to move away, and when she did not, he cupped her cheek with his palm. His hand was warm and rough and gentle. "You don't have to be anything other than what you are," he said quietly. "I am not asking you to change. I am just asking you to let me stand beside you, for as long as you will have me. We can figure out the rest as we go." Rose felt something break open inside her chest, and to her horror tears started sliding down her cheeks, mixing with the rain water already there. She could not remember the last time she had cried, not even at her father's and brother's funeral. The tears came faster and she could not stop them, could not control them, and then Xavier was pulling her against his chest, and she was sobbing into his wet shirt while the storm crashed around them. He held her while she cried, one hand stroking her back, murmuring soft words she could not quite hear over her own weeping. She cried for her mother and her father and her brother, for the home that had burned, for all the years she had spent locked behind stone walls of her own making. She cried until she had no tears left, and then she just stood there trembling against Xavier's solid warmth, feeling emptied out and strangely light. "I am sorry," she finally managed to whisper. "Don't be," Xavier said. "You have been holding that in for too long. It needed to come out." She pulled back slightly to look up at him. His shirt was soaked with her tears and rain water, his eyes were concerned but not pitying, and his arms were still around her like he had no intention of letting go unless she asked him to. "I am afraid," she admitted, "of this, of feeling too much. Every time I have loved someone, they have been taken away." "I know," Xavier said. "I know that fear. When my wife died, I swore I would never let myself care about anyone again. It hurt too much. But being alone hurt too, just in a different way. And then I saw you, and something in me recognized something in you, like we were both broken in the same places. Maybe we can be broken together. Maybe that is better than being broken alone." Rose thought about that, about what it might mean to let someone in, to risk the pain for the chance at something more. It went against every survival instinct she had developed. But standing there in Xavier's arms with the storm raging outside and her heart cracked open, she found herself nodding. "Maybe," she whispered, "maybe we can try." Xavier smiled then, and it transformed his entire face, erasing years of grief and solitude. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she did not, he kissed her. His lips were soft and tentative, asking rather than demanding, and Rose found herself kissing him back, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders. It was gentle and careful, a first kiss between two people who had forgotten how to be gentle. And when they finally pulled apart, Rose felt dizzy. "Stay with me tonight," Xavier said. "Not like that, I mean just stay. I don't want you walking back alone in the storm, and I don't want to leave you. We can sit by the stove and dry off and just be together." "Is that all right?" Rose nodded, not trusting her voice. They shed their wet outer layers and hung them to dry. Then Xavier built up the fire in the wood stove while Rose found a blanket. They sat together on one of the narrow beds, sharing the blanket, watching the flames dance through the stove's grate while the storm continued outside. Xavier told her about his wife, about their brief happy marriage and the devastation of losing her and their baby in one terrible night. Rose told him about her family, about the fire, about the months since when she had felt more ghost than woman. They talked until the storm passed and the stars came out, and then they lay down together, still clothed, just holding each other. Rose felt Xavier's heartbeat steady and strong beneath her ear, felt his arms secure around her, and for the first time since the fire she felt safe. She fell asleep that way and did not dream of burning. When she woke the next morning, Xavier was already up, making coffee on the small stove. He smiled when he saw her awake and brought her a cup, sitting beside her on the bed. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Rose replied, cupping the warm mug in her hands. Everything from the night before came flooding back, and she felt her cheeks heat. "About last night, no regrets," Xavier said firmly. "Not on my end. But if you have them, we can forget it happened and go back to just working together. I meant what I said. You don't have to be anything but what you are." Rose thought about it, searching her feelings carefully. She felt raw and exposed, vulnerable in a way that made her want to run. But she also felt something else, something warm and hopeful that she had thought was dead. "No regrets," she said finally. "Just fear, but I think maybe the fear means it matters." Xavier's smile was like sunrise. "Then we will go slow. We will figure this out together. And in the meantime, we have horses to train." The days that followed were both the same and completely different. They still worked side by side from dawn until dusk, still talked about horses and fences and weather. But now there were other moments too. Xavier's hand on her shoulder as he passed. Rose allowing herself to stand close enough to feel his warmth. Shared smiles over private jokes, the brush of fingers when passing tools, small touches and glances that built slowly into something larger. Rose found herself softening in ways she had not thought possible. She caught herself humming while she worked. She started taking more care with her appearance, braiding her hair more neatly, washing her face in the mornings. She said yes when Xavier suggested they ride out to check the far fences together instead of splitting up. She let herself enjoy his company, his quiet strength, his dry humor that snuck up on her and made her laugh. Xavier was patient. He never pushed, never demanded more than she was ready to give. When she had bad days, when the weight of her grief settled heavy on her shoulders, he gave her space but stayed close enough that she knew he was there. When she woke from nightmares about fire, he held her until she could breathe again. When she flinched away from sudden movements or loud noises, he slowed down and gentled his voice until she felt safe again. Autumn came to the valley in a blaze of gold and crimson. The aspens on the hillsides turned brilliant yellow, and the air took on a crisp edge that spoke of winter coming. Xavier and Rose worked to prepare the ranch for the cold months ahead, stockpiling hay, repairing the barn roof, making sure the horses were in good condition. They moved around each other with increasing ease, their partnership deepening into something that felt inevitable. One evening in late September, after the work was done and they had eaten a simple dinner together, Xavier asked Rose to walk with him. They strolled away from the ranch buildings, up into the hills where the aspens glowed golden in the last light. The air smelled of fallen leaves and wood smoke from someone's distant chimney. They did not talk, just walked side by side, and Rose felt a peace she had not known existed. Xavier stopped at a high point where they could see the valley spread out below them, the ranch small and perfect in its hollow, the mountains rising dark against the sunset sky. "I love this land," he said quietly. "I love the work and the horses and the way the seasons change." "But it was lonely, Rose. I was so lonely I did not even realize how much until you came along." Rose took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. It still felt strange, this casual intimacy, but it was getting easier. "I was lonely too," she said. "I just did not let myself feel it." Xavier turned to face her, his expression serious in the fading light. "I don't want to rush you, but I need you to know that this is not temporary for me. What I feel for you is real and deep, and I want to build a life with you if you will have me. I want to wake up with you every morning and work beside you every day and fall asleep with you every night. I want to face whatever comes, good and bad, together. I know you are still healing. I know you may not be ready, but I wanted you to know where I stand. Rose's heart was pounding so hard she thought Xavier must be able to hear it. Every instinct screamed at her to protect herself, to pull back, to run before she could lose someone else she loved. But she looked at Xavier's face, at the honesty and hope and vulnerability there, and she realized that running would not protect her. It would just keep her alone, and she was so tired of being alone. "I am scared," she said, her voice shaking. "I am terrified, but I want that too. I want to try." Xavier exhaled like he had been holding his breath, and then he kissed her as the sun set behind them and the aspens whispered in the evening breeze. This kiss was different from their first, deeper and surer, a promise rather than a question. Rose kissed him back with everything she had, letting herself feel the want and the need and the love that had been building for months. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard, and Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret this," he said. "I know," Rose whispered. "I trust you." That night, Rose moved her things from the bunkhouse to the main house, to Xavier's room, to his bed. They made love slowly and carefully, learning each other's bodies with the same patience Xavier showed with his horses. Rose cried again, but this time from relief and joy and the sheer, overwhelming rightness of it. Afterwards they lay tangled together, Xavier's fingers tracing lazy patterns on her skin, and Rose felt something she had thought was lost forever. She felt at home. The months that followed were not without challenges. Rose still had days when the grief overwhelmed her, when she could barely get out of bed, when the memories of the fire haunted her waking hours. Xavier held her through those days, never trying to fix her, just being present. She had days when she pushed him away, when her old instinct to isolate kicked in when she was sharp and cold. Xavier weathered those days too, giving her space but never leaving, always coming back, slowly, so slowly she barely noticed. Rose began to heal. The cracks in the stone around her heart widened and deepened until the stone began to crumble away entirely, revealing the soft, vulnerable heart beneath. She found herself smiling more easily, laughing more often. She started to enjoy small pleasures again, the warmth of morning coffee, the way the horses nickered when they saw her coming, the feel of Xavier's hand in hers, the sound of his breathing beside her in the night. Winter came hard that year, with heavy snows that buried the valley under white silence. They spent long days caring for the horses, breaking ice on water troughs, hauling hay to the animals. The work was exhausting but satisfying, and in the evenings they retreated to the warm house where Xavier taught Rose to play chess, and Rose taught Xavier the songs her mother used to sing. They made love by firelight and talked about their dreams for the ranch, for the future, for the life they were building together. In February, Xavier rode into Montrose to buy supplies and came back with a small velvet box. That evening, with the fire crackling and snow falling softly outside, he got down on one knee and asked Rose to marry him. The ring was simple, a single small diamond on a gold band, and Rose's hands were shaking so badly Xavier had to help her put it on. She said yes through tears, and they spent the rest of the night planning their future, imagining children and growing herds and years stretching out ahead of them full of ordinary miracles. They were married in April, when the valley was bursting with new life and wildflowers painted the hillsides in rainbow colors. It was a small ceremony in Montrose with just a few witnesses, including Mrs. Henderson, who cried happy tears, and the local minister. Rose wore a simple blue dress that Xavier said brought out her eyes, and Xavier wore his best suit and looked so handsome Rose forgot to breathe. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to love and honor and cherish, promising to face whatever came together. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier kissed Rose like she was the answer to every prayer he had ever prayed. They spent their wedding night at the ranch, in their own bed, in their own home, and Rose felt a completeness she had never imagined possible. This was what she had been running from all those months ago, this vulnerability and trust and deep, abiding love. This was what terrified her so much. And it was also what saved her, what brought her back to life, what taught her how to be soft again. The years that followed were not perfect because life is never perfect. There were hard seasons and lean times, years when the weather did not cooperate or the market for horses was slow. There were losses too. Xavier's prize stallion died of colic one terrible night despite everything they tried. Rose had 2 miscarriages before she carried a baby to term, and those losses brought back all her old fears about losing the people she loved. But Xavier was there through all of it, steady as stone, patient as the changing seasons, and Rose learned that love was not about avoiding pain, but about facing it together. Their first child was born in the spring of 1885, a healthy baby boy they named Thomas after Rose's brother. Rose had been terrified throughout the pregnancy, haunted by Xavier's stories of losing his first wife in childbirth. But the delivery went smoothly, and when they placed the tiny squirming bundle in her arms, she felt a love so fierce it nearly broke her. Xavier cried when he held his son for the first time, tears of joy and relief and gratitude, and Rose knew they had both been healed a little bit more. Thomas was followed by a daughter 2 years later, whom they named Clara after Rose's mother, and then another son they named James. The house that had seemed too large and too empty when Rose first came to the ranch, filled with noise and laughter, and the beautiful chaos of family life. Rose learned to balance ranch work with motherhood, often carrying a baby on her hip while she checked on horses, or riding out with a toddler secured in front of her saddle. Xavier was a devoted father, patient with the children the way he was patient with everything, teaching them about horses and land and the value of honest work. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Xavier's horses gained a reputation for quality and reliability, and buyers came from as far as Denver and Santa Fe to purchase stock. They expanded the operation carefully, buying more land, increasing the herd, hiring seasonal help when needed. Rose proved to have a gift for breeding, an eye for matching stallions and mares to produce offspring with exactly the qualities they wanted. Together they built something solid and enduring, a legacy to pass on to their children. Rose still had moments when the grief ambushed her. She would see a father and son working together and think of her own father and Thomas, gone now for so many years. She would hear a certain song or smell wood smoke and be transported back to that terrible night. But the pain was gentler now, softened by time and love and the knowledge that life continued, that new memories overlaid old ones, that she could carry her losses without being crushed by them. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised her with a trip back to the burned remains of her family's ranch. Rose had not been back since the fire, could not bear to see the destruction. But Xavier thought maybe it was time, and he was right. They rode out in the early morning, just the two of them, leaving the children with Mrs. Henderson, who had become something like a grandmother to them. The land had healed itself. New grass grew where the house had stood, and wildflowers bloomed in profusion. The burned timber had weathered and broken down, returning to the earth. It was peaceful there, beautiful even, and Rose could feel the ghosts of her family not as haunting presences, but as gentle memories. She stood in what had been the center of her childhood home and said goodbye properly, thanking them for the years they had together, promising to remember them, releasing them to whatever came after. Xavier stood beside her with his hand on her shoulder, solid and warm and alive. When she was ready, they mounted their horses and rode back to their own ranch, to their own home, to the life they had built from ashes and grief and persistent love. Rose looked back once before the old place disappeared from view, and then she turned her face forward and did not look back again. More years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the growing children. Thomas grew tall and serious like his father, with a gift for gentling even the most fractious horses. Clara was fierce and independent like her mother, demanding to learn everything the boys learned and usually mastering it faster. James was the baby, sweet-natured and musical, always singing while he worked. Rose watched them grow with wonder and gratitude, these miracles she and Xavier had created together. The children were not sheltered from hardship. This was the West in the late 19th century, and life was still rough in many ways. They learned early about death when beloved animals died, about disappointment when crops failed or horses went lame, about the necessity of hard work and the satisfaction of doing things right. But they also learned about love, about family, about the importance of standing together. They saw their parents' partnership, the way Xavier and Rose worked side by side as equals, the way they supported and challenged and cherished each other, and they learned what a good marriage looked like. In 1895, when Rose was 35 and Xavier was 42, they sat together on the porch one summer evening after the children had gone to bed. The valley spread out before them in the golden light, peaceful and prosperous. The horses grazed contentedly in the pastures. The sounds of crickets and a distant owl filled the air. Xavier had his arm around Rose's shoulders, and she was leaning into his warmth, and they were both tired from a long day of good work. "You remember when we met?" Xavier asked, his voice quiet and contemplative. "I remember thinking you were gentle with that injured horse," Rose said. "I remember Mrs. Henderson telling me you had lost your wife and baby. I remember feeling nothing, like I was already dead inside. I remember seeing you in town and thinking you looked like I felt," Xavier said. "Lost and angry and alone. I remember deciding to take a chance, to offer you work even though everyone said it was foolish to hire a woman for ranch work. Best decision I ever made." Rose turned to look at him, this man who had saved her without even trying, who had simply been patient enough to wait while she remembered how to be soft, how to feel, how to love. His hair was graying now at the temples, his face more lined, but his eyes were still that clear creek water color, and his hands were still gentle. "I did not know how to be soft anymore," she said. "I had forgotten. You waited for me to remember." Xavier smiled and kissed her forehead. "You were always soft, Rose. You just had it buried deep to protect yourself. I am honored that you trusted me enough to let it show again." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge one by one. Then Rose said, "What do you think happens next? We are not young anymore. The children will grow up and leave. What will we do when it is just us again?" "What we have always done," Xavier said simply. "Work the ranch, breed good horses, take care of each other, maybe travel a little if we can afford it. I have always wanted to see the Pacific Ocean. But mostly I just want to be with you, wherever that is and whatever we are doing. That is enough for me. It is more than enough." Rose felt tears prick her eyes, happy tears this time. "It is enough for me too," she whispered. "More than I ever dreamed possible." The children did grow up. as children do. Thomas married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread and started his own operation nearby, coming home regularly to consult with his parents and let his own children learn from their grandparents. Clara shocked everyone by moving to Denver to become a teacher, but she came home every summer and never lost her connection to the land. James showed more interest in music than ranching and eventually moved to Santa Fe to play piano in a hotel, but he sent letters faithfully and visited when he could. Rose and Xavier grew older together, their bodies slowing but their partnership only deepening. They sold off some of the horses as they could no longer manage such a large operation, keeping just enough to occupy their days and supplement their savings. They spent more time sitting on the porch, watching sunsets, talking about memories. Xavier taught Rose to read better, something she had never fully mastered as a child, and they worked through books together in the evenings. Rose taught Xavier to cook more than just basic trail meals, and they experimented with recipes, laughing at the disasters and celebrating the successes. On their 25th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren, Xavier stood up at the dinner table and raised his glass. "I want to toast my wife," he said, his voice still strong despite the years. 25 years ago, I married the most stubborn, difficult, wonderful woman I have ever known. She did not make it easy, but nothing worth having ever is. Rose, you taught me that it was possible to love again after loss, that broken hearts can heal, that patience and persistence and devotion are stronger than fear. I would live these 25 years over again 1,000 times, and I look forward to whatever years we have left together. I love you." Rose stood up, tears streaming down her face, and kissed him in front of everyone. Their children cheered and the grandchildren giggled, and Rose felt surrounded by love so deep and wide she could have drowned in it happily. "I love you too," she said when she could speak. "You gave me back my life. You gave me everything." They lived on the ranch for another 15 years, growing older but never losing their connection to the land and the horses and each other. Xavier's joints grew stiff with arthritis and Rose's vision started to fail, but they adapted, helping each other, compensating for each other's weaknesses. When Xavier could no longer ride easily, Rose became his legs, checking on the remaining horses and reporting back. When Rose could no longer thread a needle to mend clothes, Xavier learned to do it himself, squinting over the fabric with endearing concentration. Xavier died peacefully in the spring of 1920, at the age of 67. He had been out checking on a mare that was due to foal, something he insisted on doing himself despite Rose's protests. She found him sitting against the barn wall with a small smile on his face, the newborn foal standing on wobbly legs nearby. The doctor said it was his heart, quick and painless. Rose held his cooling hand and thanked him for 40 years of patient, persistent love. Then she did what needed to be done, calling the children, arranging the funeral, dealing with all the practical details. The children wanted her to move to town to live with one of them, to stop working so hard. But Rose refused. She was 60 years old and still strong, and the ranch was her home, filled with memories of Xavier in every corner. She kept a small herd of horses, hired help for the heavy work, and continued the life they had built together. She planted flowers on Xavier's grave and visited it daily, talking to him about the horses, the weather, the children and grandchildren, everything and nothing. Rose lived for another 10 years, dying in her sleep at the age of 70, in the bed she had shared with Xavier for 4 decades. They found her in the morning looking peaceful, one hand stretched across to Xavier's side of the bed as if reaching for him. The family buried her next to Xavier, under the aspens that had witnessed their love story, and the stone marker reads simply, Rose Dalton Stone, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother, she learned to be soft again. The ranch passed to Thomas, who ran it with his own children, teaching them the values his parents had taught him. The main house remained largely unchanged, a shrine to Xavier and Rose's partnership, with photographs on the walls showing them young and old, working with horses, holding babies, standing together against the landscape they loved. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren grew up hearing stories about the cowboy who was patient enough to wait, and the woman who forgot how to be soft, but remembered when it mattered most. Years turned into decades and decades into a century, and the world changed beyond recognition. The Wild West became the Old West, became history and legend. But in that valley in Colorado, on land that had been tamed by patience and persistence and love, Xavier and Rose's story lived on. It lived in the bloodlines of horses that traced back to their original breeding program. It lived in the memories of descendants who still worked the land. It lived in the way Thomas taught his own daughter to be both strong and soft, to protect herself, but also to remain open to love. It lived in the way Clara told her students that true strength was not about walls, but about choosing vulnerability despite the risk. The story became family legend, embellished and romanticized over the years, but with a core of truth that never changed. A woman who had been shattered by loss, and a man who had been hollowed by grief, both of them learning to live again, learning to love again, learning that healing was possible if you were patient enough to wait for it. Their graves under the aspens became a place where family members went when they needed to remember what mattered, when they needed to be reminded that love was worth the risk, that broken things could be made whole, that softness was not weakness but the greatest courage of all. And sometimes, on spring evenings when the aspens were golden and the air smelled of wildflowers, people swore they could see two figures on horseback riding across the valley, side by side, heading home together. Just stories, of course, the romantic imaginings of people who wanted to believe in love that lasted beyond death. But maybe, just maybe, there was some truth to it. Maybe love like theirs really did transcend mortality. Maybe patience and devotion, and choosing each other every single day really could create something eternal. The ranch still stands, smaller now but still operational, still breeding quality horses, still teaching children and grandchildren about hard work and integrity, and the value of doing things right. The main house has been updated over the years, but still has the wide porch where Xavier and Rose spent so many evenings watching the sunset. The barn where Xavier died has been rebuilt, but occupies the same footprint. The graves under the aspens are carefully maintained, fresh flowers appearing regularly, placed there by descendants who never met Xavier and Rose, but who carry their legacy in their blood and bones. And the story continues to be told, generation after generation, about the cowboy who was patient enough to wait and the woman who learned to be soft again. It is told as a love story, which it was. It is told as a Western story, which it was. But mostly it is told as a story about healing, about the power of patient, persistent devotion, about the way broken people can find each other and slowly, carefully, piece themselves back together. In the end, that is what Xavier and Rose's story really was. Not about dramatic rescues or grand gestures, but about the quiet daily choice to love each other, to be present for each other, to weather storms together and celebrate sunshine together. It was about Xavier's infinite patience as Rose slowly, painfully learned to trust again, to feel again, to open her scarred heart. It was about Rose's courage in choosing vulnerability despite every instinct screaming at her to protect herself. It was about two broken people deciding that maybe broken together was better than broken alone. And they were right. They built a life that mattered, raised children who carried their values forward, created something beautiful and enduring from ashes and grief. They proved that it is never too late to heal, never too late to love, never too late to become soft again if you have someone patient enough to wait while you remember how. Their story became a testament to the transformative power of love, not the easy kind of love that comes naturally, but the hard-won kind that requires patience and persistence, and showing up every single day even when it is difficult. So the story lives on, told around dinner tables and at family gatherings, passed down from great-grandparents to grandchildren, keeping Xavier and Rose alive in memory and legend. And every time it is told, someone listening takes courage from it, draws strength from it, learns that they too can heal if they are patient with themselves, if they find someone patient enough to wait, if they remember that softness is not weakness but the truest form of strength. That is the legacy Xavier and Rose Stone left behind. Not just the ranch and the horses and the descendants, though those were considerable, but the story itself, the hope it carried, the truth at its heart. That love heals, that patience matters, that broken people can become whole again, and that learning to be soft after hardness is one of the bravest things anyone can do. And that legacy lives on still, over a century later, inspiring new generations to take the risk, to trust, to love, to remember how to be soft even when the world has tried to harden them beyond recognition. Xavier and Rose would have liked that, knowing their story mattered, knowing it helped people long after they were gone. They would have smiled at each other, those secret smiles that passed between them throughout their 40 years together, and Xavier would have taken Rose's hand, and they would have watched the sunset together one more time, content in the knowledge that what they built together would last long after they were just dust under the aspens. And that, in the end, was enough.